driven into the public consciousness that Western Ukraine generally tends toward Europe, toward the West, Eastern Ukraine, toward Russia, that sort of thing. But what has not been stressed to the point where it should be stressed is the simple fact that the uprising, regardless of whether its particular strategic characters, strategic interests go toward either independence or joining Russia or staying in the Ukraine with a greater degree of autonomy, regardless of those particular tactical objectives, the basic point about that uprising is that it is a progressive uprising. It is an uprising of people who are demanding surcease from austerity, from privatization, from unemployment, from collapsing social services. There was one expert pointed out recently that given the fact, and Obama in a speech today is bragging about how the IMF is coming to the rescue of the Ukraine. The fact of the matter is the IMF has already imposed upon Ukraine and the Kiev government, at least under Yatsevich, if not under this new guy, Poroshenko, that they had already accepted the typical kinds of straitjacket squeezes and restraints and that has been imposed by the IMF on countries all over the world. So here you have in eastern and southern Ukraine a genuine movement based largely in the working class, particularly in Lugansk and Donetsk, the two regions that are heavily industrialized. And these are movements of workers largely demanding not just a better treatment from Kiev, but also demanding a more enlightened, more progressive, more generally socially fair outlook to, and policy toward people who are suffering, have been suffering under the terrible burdens of a global depression. Finally, where are we at this very moment? Again, one can speculate, but one has the feeling that when Poroshenko, who was kind of elected by default, he's somebody who actually, a big candy manufacturer, has got a lot of interest apparently in Russia. He sells a lot of candy to Russia, apparently, among other things. Vast numbers, of course, in eastern and southern Ukraine, whether it be by choice or by intimidation, did not vote. But nevertheless, among those who voted, given the choices, particularly the main opposition be Yulia Tymoshenko, who people say is a bigger crook than the others, and mind-boggling, so that this Poroshenko comes into office and comes in largely, because of his economic ties with Russia, seemingly in a position to bring about some kind of reconciliation because the contours of some kind of an agreement are there. Namely, that eastern and southern Ukraine enjoy a greater degree of autonomy, that there be some break from a highly concentrated, highly centralized kind of political system into one which gives a greater degree of authority to those at the grassroots and in various regions of the country. That seemed to be possibly in the making. Suddenly, though, Poroshenko sends an awakened military establishment in the Ukraine, probably being armed by the West at this point, into Donetsk to take back the airport, to engage in a lot of killing. And one cannot escape the suspicion that Poroshenko decided to take this route largely because he was persuaded that Putin and the Russians would not respond, that there would not be any major incursion by Russian forces into Ukraine. The Russians have their own interests. Those are not internationalist interests. Those are interests based largely upon an unwillingness to take on the burdens that would be attached to annexation, as it were, or even a voluntary annexation from those forces in eastern and southern Ukraine who would like to join Russia. But there are tremendous problems attendant to that, and also, of course, there's a desire on the part of the Russians not to weaken and undermine their complex economic and political ties with the West. So Poroshenko has done this, and it rekindles a serious situation, because I don't think that there's any guarantee at this particular moment that the Russians won't intervene should the killing go on. And should that happen, we would be confronted in not only a growing potential civil war within the Ukraine, but also a growing potential global conflict between Russia and the West. And that's something I think that the peace movement in the United States has to grab hold of and understand, regardless of our attitudes on various particulars. At this juncture, it's pretty clear what we ought to be demanding. One, that NATO stay out of this area of the world. Number two, that every effort be made to bring the contending forces together into genuine, mutually respectful negotiations to solve these problems. Number three, that the voices of the people of Ukraine, and not just those in South and East, but after all, the Maidan demonstrations originally, in their earliest stages, following patterns that we all well know about, were designed in large measure to protest not just the kleptocracy that the Yanukovych government represented, but the policies that it had represented in kowtowing to NATO, kowtowing to the International Monetary Fund, agreeing, as its successors rapidly did, agreeing to accept these horrible terms for quote, so-called economic aid. So you have the potential for progressive forces in these countries trying to find shape and coherence and trying to discover their own voice. And I think that should be something that we have to, at least spiritually, recognize and associate ourselves with, as in our own interest at this particular junction. We do everything we can. And we haven't even touched, of course, on the terrible problem of the shock troops of Kiev being the most right-wing, the most anti-Semitic, the most ultra-nationalist, and the most fascistic forces in a country that has a long history, at least, of forces running through that society of that character. So those are the tasks for the peace movement. I think we need far, more discussion, more clarity, and certainly more action in preventing a broader conflagration, which would be a disaster for all. Thank you very much.
That's the sort of thing that you absolutely do not find in the mass media. You absolutely have no sense that events in contemporary Ukraine have anything to do at all with NATO, and you're hard-pressed to find any reference to neo-fascists in this context at all. So when I look at the questions posed on the flyer that was circulated for today's event, the question that stood out to me is, how should the peace movement respond to rising tensions between the two biggest nuclear powers and the U.S. shift towards covert war? And my answer to that is, my opinion on this is that, first of all, we need to educate ourselves about what is going on. We need to discover the facts, which is the point of this meeting tonight. The media obviously is not going to give us too many of the facts, and so we have to look on the internet or unusual sources of information. But again, I think that what is particularly being ignored is the NATO aspect and the presence of neo-fascists in the putsch regime that has taken power. The facts will show, as we have been told, that the Ukraine crisis is mainly, if not entirely, about NATO expansion and Russian responses, and not about Russian expansion and Putin's imagined goal of reestablishing the USSR or the old Tsarist empire, because this has been repeated again and again in the media, and of course prominent politicians, and even Prince Charles, have repeated this analogy between Hitler's seizure of the Sudetenland in 1938 and the annexation of the Crimea. And I think that the peace movement should not respond to this situation by taking sides, either, of course, by endorsing NATO and U.S. imperialism, or by endorsing Russia in its annexation of Crimea, even if we do understand that as a preemptive measure to prevent Sevastopol from forever falling into NATO hands and the Black Sea being transformed into a NATO lake. We should, however, expose the steady expansion of NATO, make it clear to people that there is a pattern here of relentless expansion, and also talk about NATO's character as, for example, revealed in the bombardment of Libya most recently, with increasingly conspicuously disastrous consequences. I want to start with these two conflicting views of what happened culminating in February. And I'll call them the US and Russian views, it being understood, of course, that in both countries there are lots of different views and our views and so on. But when I say the US view, I mean the view of the US State Department that is very immediately, consistently reiterated by the cable news networks. And when I mention the Russian point of view, I'm talking about that of the Russian Foreign Ministry and that I find in RT television. Does anybody else watch RT TV, channel 280, if you have Dish? It is insightful and very interesting. I recommend it, even if you access it online. The U.S. view. The Ukrainian people have long held what Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, calls European aspirations. So, which is to say that they don't want to be close to Russia anymore. They want to be part of Europe. It's a very vague concept. They want to be part of European values, the presumption being that Russians don't hold the same values. But Nuland, last November, at a Chevron-hosted gathering in the U.S., boasted that the U.S. had invested $5 billion in democracy in Ukraine and in encouraging European aspirations. So last year, after President Yanukovych had tentatively agreed to an association arrangement with the EU, he rethought it. And why is this? Because Vladimir Putin had presented him with a better offer. Or rather, I think that if it were submitted to a group of economists, they might be divided about the benefits of this or the other option. But when it was announced that no, Ukraine would not sign the agreement of association with the EU, then there was a great deal of opposition, as though the people had been betrayed. I don't know all the aspects of the tentative agreement with Russia, but it did involve continued supply of natural gas at 30% discount, and also something like a $15 billion loan. So it was a substantial offer that Yanukovych decided to accept, however, not ruling out later a modified agreement with the EU. By the way, a European Union association agreement is simply defined as a treaty between the EU and a non-EU country that creates a framework for cooperation with sections on political, trade, social, cultural, and security links. As of now, an agreement has indeed been signed, but the trade aspects of it have not yet been worked out. Anyway, in outrage at this decision by Yanukovych, tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of people rallied in the Maidan, in the square in Kiev, with the encouragement of the United States. Nuland herself appeared in the square, so did Senator McCain. And according to the U.S. narrative, the security forces ran amok, behaved very brutally, firing on the people, killing over 100, resulting in Yanukovych losing support and being overthrown February 23rd by a popular protest, a kind of genuine people's uprising. Arseniy Yatsenyuk, a banker who had earlier been in the Ukrainian administration, known to favor EU and NATO admission, and so headed by Yatsenyuk as a prime minister and President Alexander Turchinov. But the US interpretation continues, Russia didn't like this. And it's all very personalized. Putin was upset by this because he wanted to control the Ukraine. And so he whips up dissatisfaction in the East and the South. So it's this familiar theme of outside agitators producing this dissatisfaction in the East. And Putin continues by organizing a bogus referendum in Crimea and conducting military exercises along the eastern border to intimidate Ukraine. And that is the situation. Now, the Russian view is markedly different. No, there was not a popular uprising that legitimately ousted a government. The events of February 17 to 23 were a putsch. You don't often hear that word, but it means a coordinated and rapid and brutal seizure of power. It's not your typical coup, but something that's organized in order to terrify people and use the conditions in order to seize power. That's what the Russians are calling it. And in this putsch, vitally, there was the participation of neo-fascist armed groups. Now, there's a particular significance of this in the Ukraine because there has been historically an active, large-scale fascist movement. And if you watch RT television, you'll be well educated about this history, but I think few people really associate